You need a market economy, but you need to also look at how you create, through innovation, highly productive organizations. The place to start is, economists tend to talk always about production efficiency, but actually GDP is made up of value added of companies. And high value added in companies is about two things. It's about production efficiency, but it's also about competitive advantage. So you can create high value added by, as Henry Ford did, by having production lines, and that made it just cheaper to produce cars. But you can also get competitive advantage by designing a product which is much more attractive to the consumer, and therefore you can charge higher prices. A classic example of that would be Steve Jobs and the iPhone. So the issue becomes, how do you get that innovation, both to increase production efficiency and to get competitive advantage? And you have to look at such things as the educational system, entrepreneurship, and your national innovation system to understand how you get a high rate of innovation to get high value added per capita. We don't have a very good rate of innovation. If you compare it with what's happening in China, I mean, they're catching us up. And different countries have different problems. But I think there are three which are pretty typical of a lot of Western countries. One is the educational system. Particularly if you look at America, I mean, they're just not producing enough scientists and engineers now to meet the needs of industry, and there are not enough technicians, which is partly why they're putting R&D facilities in America. So there's big issues on education. I think there are big issues on national innovation systems. So to what extent a government is putting money into scientific research, but also into generic research, generic technology research, which America does, but it only does it with the excuse that this is sort of defense spending. But if you look at a lot of American industries have been very successful, you'll find a lot of the R&D in the kind of generic technologies, things like the internet, actually came from government money. So there's a big issue on national innovation systems. And then third, which is true both of America and the UK, and particularly UK and America, which is our governance system of our companies is now quite dysfunctional, I think, in terms of long-term funding for major development. And you've only got to look at the work that Bill Lasonic has actually been talking about in this conference, about the enormous amount of share buybacks going on, which means companies are just not putting the investment into new technologies. And it's a pretty fair criticism of both the UK and America that the thing has become too much about value extraction from companies rather than value creation. So if it's a choice of do you have some share buybacks which put up the share price, or do you invest long term? Too many American companies and British companies are saying, well, we'll do share buybacks, get the price up. That helps our remuneration system, as opposed to saying, no, we've got to make a long-term commitment investment in a new technology.
I think Adam Smith was a brilliant economist and a brilliant moral philosopher, but I think every economist and every moral philosopher are creatures of the times. And I think we learned two things from Adam Smith, but it points to what we haven't learned as well. The first is he understood the importance of trade, and he understood therefore the importance of the division of labour and the specialisation of labour, and that is absolutely central to the wealth of nations. But he didn't, and this is why David's work is so important. He didn't understand the importance of innovation. He didn't really interest himself in how this modern new manufacturing sector was going to develop and what would spur it on. So I think from classical economic theory, a discussion of innovation has been pretty poor. And then, secondly, he was a moral philosopher, and he wanted values to underpin the market. So he was interested in the public good, and he was interested in public goods like education and how you should invest in it. But I don't think he saw the importance of public investment to the future of the economy so much as the future of society. He wanted education to make people good citizens. I'm not sure that he thought of training in any real sense for people who were working even in agriculture, but also, of course, in the developing embryonic industries. So I think Adam Smith tells us a huge amount about how globalization would develop, because trade is so important, and financial globalization, of course, is part of that as well. He doesn't tell us much about the importance of innovation and education to the economy, and that's where I think what David is doing is saying, look, classical economists have actually ignored these two big issues, and it's time to look at them a bit more seriously. And I know, as someone who was a finance minister for many years, that if you're sitting in a treasury or a finance ministry, you're thinking of a whole series of issues. Inflation, of course, was the major problem until fairly recently. You're thinking of issues of financial stability, which, of course, have been the issues of the last 10 years. But you should be thinking of what is going to lead to greater productivity in your economy. And, of course, the rate of productivity and growth, people call it a productivity puzzle in Britain. I think David is really saying in his work that it's not really a puzzle in the sense it cannot be understood. It's not a mystery. It's a failure to invest in innovation and a failure to invest in education. And we've got to discuss the proper balance between the public and the private sector in doing this. And too often, as we said, get the public sector out of the way, but actually it's not picking winners, but it's not doing nothing. It's supporting some of the key technologies. It's supporting skills and science as big factor conditions in the economy. And that makes sense of public investment in innovation, and at least government sponsorship of innovation in certain key respects. People don't think globalization's working. I mean, you come to a simple proposition that people feel it's, as I would say, it lacks a human face. It's like a runaway train that's out of control. People feel that they're losing out. And of course, these remarkable changes that are taking place across the world, for 150 years, the West had a majority of production, a majority of investment, a majority of all the manufacturing and all the trade in the world economy. So populations as small as Europe and America, in comparison with the rest of the world, had a majority of all these things. And suddenly, it's a process that's been happening for maybe 30 years, but suddenly you've got this realization that the majority of production, the majority of manufacturing, the majority of trade, and the majority of investment is actually outside the West. And we have got to come to terms with that. But of course, what it's meant is that the manufacturing industries of the West have been under pressure. Service sector employment has been growing, but it's relatively low paid. You've got a bigger division between the top and the rest, and this middle skilled workers, people who were getting relatively good wages in manufacturing, that sector has been eroded. And of course, people come to blame countries that they say are taking their jobs. And of course, that's the point that President Trump made in his election campaign, that these jobs are being stolen from America by someone else. And so globalization is not just about what you have, it's about who you are and a sense of identity. And people feel that their identity is under pressure. The country's not what it used to be. It's changed out of all recognition. So you can start to explain populism that has led to nationalism, that has led to protectionism, which has led, of course, through protectionism to pressures on growth, and may also be pressures on the fiscal policy because of vested interests who are complaining about we need subsidies for this and that. So you can start to understand, I think, through the process in which the world has changed over these last few years in such a way that the center of gravity of the world economy is shifting eastwards. I think you can start to explain a lot of the populism that we now see.
I think it was quite interesting in the discussion this afternoon. There is a very strong resistance always in the neoclassical economists to any idea that low growth in the G7 countries is a product of fast growth in China. But that is the reality. And so there's been this view that everyone benefits from globalization. It's not even clear to me that all countries benefit, but certainly all communities don't benefit. And of course, what you've seen is whole communities who've been wiped out in G7 countries by competition from abroad. And I don't think we've been nearly alert enough to that in terms of regional policy or trying to get clusters into these areas. And this is true both of, you can see it in the supporters of Trump. These come from places which have really been devastated industrially, and the same is true in a lot of northern communities in the UK. And we just haven't spent enough energy in looking what you can do to put new industries, new high-growth industries into those areas. And of course, there comes a point when people say, no, we want back sovereignty. We don't want to be at the mercy of economic forces we can't control. There are quite a lot of different changes you've got to make. What we've done on regional policy in the past of either trying to move jobs to the devastated areas or to move the people from the devastated areas to where the jobs are have totally failed. We've got to find a way of putting the high value-added jobs back into those communities. I don't think you can say, look, we'll put these jobs in this particular place. Where there are already clusters, government can support giving that support to the clusters already existing and expanding them. And if you look across the country, there are quite a lot of clusters in different places which you could expand. And then I think there are policies like science parks and whatnot attached to universities, where again, you can, without supporting a particular industry, you can support the growth of new high-tech businesses. So I think there are things you can do, but we've got to do a lot more of them if this is going to work. It is it's a really very long-term issue, particularly technician training, technical education, where one's very reliant on businesses working in schemes like apprenticeship schemes, and also with technical education in further education colleges. This dramatically depends on business leadership. But of course also the whole basic issue of increasing innovation in business is something that business leaders have got to take on as a much more important role.
I think business has got to wake up to the fact that these problems are here to stay unless we do something about them. That I don't see the economic discontent that arises from economic change as being temporary, as transient. I think the most likely scenario is, unless we do nothing, that people will become more frustrated about the economic prospects of their children and more frustrated about their own failure to do better. I think the cultural aspects of this populism, again, people's worries about immigration, people's worries about the heterogeneity of their society, about the integration of people. I think in more diverse societies that could become a bigger problem and not a smaller problem if we do nothing. And I think equally the anti-politics sentiment that is now a part of this populism, I think it's very difficult to see, if you put it very bluntly, politicians becoming more popular. I mean, I think people in these positions are being blamed for things that are going wrong. So unless we do things differently, I think business leaders and indeed the general population have got to expect that we will still have large-scale economic discontent, cultural pessimism and anti-politics sentiment. And people will tend to vote increasingly for something new, something different, something eccentric even, something in some cases extreme. And that's why you see nationalist populist movements rising across Europe in particular, but it's not just confined to Europe, where nationalism has been found to be a powerful weapon that people can use to galvanize people who are discontented about other things in the first place. So what are the policies? Globalization is here to stay, so it's how you manage it better. And so at a domestic level, it seems to me you've got to think about how you can help people who are moving from one job to another with retraining, as David has said. You've got to help people get the top jobs and get the better jobs by giving them the chance of an education, and you cannot price people out of education, which is a problem that we we face, but particularly in the developing world, where the chances of getting university education are very, very limited for many, many people. I think you've got to look at some of the jobs that actually we need done, which are face-to-face, person-to-person, caring jobs, and see whether we actually value them properly. We introduced tax credits to help those people who were on minimum wages. As long as there's a minimum wage, you can do this. Help people on minimum wages who had maybe 2 or 3 in a family get additional tax credits, so that while they could not keep their children out of poverty simply on a minimum wage, they could, because the tax system was effectively giving them money rather than taking money from them. So there is a number of things that we could actually do, and we've been pretty, I think, reluctant to take some of these changes. But internationally, you've got to, I think, begin to understand that some of these problems cannot be solved without international cooperation. I mean, climate change is obvious, financial instability. I mean, it can affect the whole world by contagion very quickly, unless you have some regime that is bound to achieve financial stability. So go through all the, even growth and trade. I mean, the contribution that is made by cooperation between countries is actually important to the maintenance of growth. So we've got to think about why it is the case that instead of people saying, this kind of cooperation wasn't working, we better have a better kind of cooperation. People then say, we'll have no cooperation at all. And so we resort to silos, nationalist silos. And I think someone somewhere, and we're actually waiting for this leadership, I think, in the G20 and elsewhere, has got to, again, put the case for cooperation. Because it's the failure of cooperation in certain instances that is the issue, not the failure of cooperation as a principle. And I don't think that most of the problems we have, and take tax avoidance and tax evasion as a good example. I mean, if you take the growth of tax havens, I mean, you cannot solve that unless you have international cooperation to isolate or to penalize those tax havens who refuse to play by the rules and refuse to exchange information and refuse to be part of a global system. So you need international cooperation. So on the one hand, what David is arguing for is look at innovation, look at education, look at the factors that can contribute to higher growth. And then on the other hand, look at how the international system could work better. And that may mean, as David has been arguing, reform of the World Trade Organization, a different role for the IMF, different priorities for the World Bank. These are some of the issues we've got to be discussing, and then persuade the public that there is some virtue in cooperation.
People are not realizing that we have to rethink some of the economic theories here.
When you talk to publishers these days, the books that are in demand are books that are about ideas. I mean, people are looking for new thinking, partly because the environment is now a far bigger issue, and so traditional economic policy was about economic efficiency and social welfare, the two objectives. Now you cannot talk about economic policy without a trinity of objectives that include environmental stewardship. So partly because that is a very significant change in the way we think of the world, partly because, as David has said, traditional theories have not served us well. And they were found wanting when it came to the financial crisis, and there's been a period of reconsideration, but perhaps it has not been, as David is suggesting, radical enough. Perhaps we haven't integrated ideas about the importance of innovation and education to productivity growth, and therefore to growth as a whole in the economy. We certainly are caught in an old-fashioned view of sovereignty and an old-fashioned view of how we view if you like, independence of nation states in a world that is fundamentally interdependent. And so any country's independence is now limited by the amount of interdependence that exists in the world, and we haven't really thought about that well enough. So yes, there is a failure of ideas. If it's a failure of leadership, it's not, in my view, because people set out to be untrustworthy, or set out to be steal from their population or anything like that. But certainly the 24-hour news cycle, the internet, the pressure on individual politicians makes them too short-termist. There's no doubt about that. And I think you need long-term thinking, and you need in a crisis particularly to be able to think through an issue in a more lateral way than most politicians feel able to do. So there's the public pressure for instantaneous action, And at the same time, there's the need to think laterally and think profoundly about issues. And I think that's where the political system has not been very good.
If we cannot find a way to compete more effectively with the developing countries, the Chinas, the South Korea and the Taiwan, there's nothing that says we have any right to a continuing rate of economic growth if we're losing competitive advantage to these countries. I don't think that's understood, and that's a failure of ideas.